There is a number that tends to stop conversations when it comes up in discussions of the global energy transition. China refines approximately 90% of the world's rare earth, processes around 60% of global lithium, and handles more than 70% of cobalt refining. Across the full range of critical metals, the materials that go into EV batteries, wind turbines, and advanced electronics, China controls between 50 and 98% of midstream processing capacity, depending on the specific metal. Since 2023, China has also invested more than $120 billion in overseas mining assets, locking upstream stakes in lithium, copper, nickel, rare earth, and bauxite across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And in April 2025, followed by October 2025, Beijing imposed export controls on 12 heavy rare earth elements and expanded restrictions to related compounds, magnet manufacturing technologies, and, in some cases, foreign-made products that contain Chinese origin materials. This episode maps who sits where in that system, what each actor is actually trying to do, and most importantly, where the leverage really comes from. Because the standard framing, China controls the mines, is the least accurate part of the story. Welcome to the China Memo. We make unbiased observations on structural trends. I'm your host, born in China, trained in Western finance. A brief orientation here before mapping the actors. Critical minerals is a category that covers the inputs required for the energy transition and advanced defense systems. Lithium and cobalt for batteries, rare earth elements for permanent magnets used in EV motors and wind turbines, copper for electrical infrastructure, nickel for battery cathodes, graphite for battery anodes, and others. The supply chain for each of these materials has 3 stages. The first is mining, extracting ore from the ground. The second is processing, or midstream, refining raw ore into purified metals, oxides, or chemical compounds that manufacturers can actually use. The third is manufacturing, turning processed materials into components, such as battery cells, magnets, cathodes, anodes. Most coverage of China's position in critical minerals focuses on the first stage. That focus is misplaced. China's real leverage sits in the second, processing, and increasingly in the third. It is in fact a chemistry and engineering story, not a geology story. China's position in critical minerals processing was not acquired by accident or by chance of geology. It was built deliberately, over decades, through a combination of state investment, tolerance for environmental costs that Western countries largely did not accept, and a systematic acquisition of processing know-how. The rare earth case is the most documented. In the 1980s, China acquired solvent extraction technology from France, the chemical process used to separate individual rare earth elements from mixed ore. Think of solvent extraction as a series of chemical washes, each one pulling out a slightly different element based on its specific chemical properties. For heavy rare earth like dysprosium, this requires 12 to 15 sequential stages, each requiring specific reagents, equipment, and environmental management. China scaled this process beyond what most countries were willing to permit in terms of waste management and water use, and invested in accumulated engineering knowledge required to run it efficiently at scale. The result? China controls close to 90% of rare earth processing and effectively 100% of heavy rare earth separation capacity. A University of Virginia analysis summarizes the asymmetry precisely. China has roughly a 4-to-1 leverage advantage over the US in raw rare earth, but closer to 10-to-1 in refined rare earth, where the separation and magnet-making choke points sit. For lithium, the picture is structurally similar. More than 70% of global lithium supply came from Australia in 2021, but 72% of refining took place in China. The ore is extracted in one place. The value is added in another. For cobalt, the Democratic Republic of Congo produces most of the world's supply, but approximately 90% of that cobalt has been refined in China. Since 2023, China has been extending this model upstream. The $120 billion in overseas mining investment is not about securing ore that China couldn't otherwise access on global markets. It is about extending China's position further up the chain, ensuring that the ore flowing into Chinese refineries is, in most cases, ore from Chinese-controlled or Chinese-invested mines. The target geographies reflect the resource map: cobalt and copper in the DRC and Zambia, lithium in Zimbabwe and across South America, rare earth in Africa and Southeast Asia. This is a unified system. Upstream stakes plus midstream dominance plus downstream manufacturing control. Each layer reinforces the other. For Western manufacturers in defense, automotive, electronics, and renewable energy, the exposure is not evenly distributed, but it is structural. The defense sector is the most acutely exposed. Rare earth permanent magnets are required for precision-guided munitions, jet engines, radar systems, submarine motors, and a range of other military applications. The U.S. defense industrial base has been described by the think tank CSIS as entirely dependent on China for certain heavy rare earth elements and magnet types, a characterization that held even after several years of active diversification effort. For EVs and renewable energy, the exposure sits in battery materials. China produces over 90% of battery cathode and anode materials globally. An EV battery cathode, the positive electrode that largely determines energy density and range, is almost certainly made from materials that pass through Chinese processing at some point in the supply chain, regardless of where the final vehicle was assembled. In October 2025, China expanded its export controls. For the broader tech sector, this was a massive shift. This wasn't just a simple restriction. It added a whole new layer of complexity. Here is why. The new rules extend China's licensing power to foreign-made products. If a product contains Chinese rare earth or uses Chinese refining technology, Beijing now claims jurisdiction. If this sounds familiar, it's because it mirrors the US Foreign Direct Product Rule. That's the rule the US uses to control chips made abroad with American technology. And China is now using that exact same logic. To put this into perspective, think this way. Imagine a magnet manufactured in Germany. If it uses dysprosium refined in China, it can now be subject to Chinese licensing. It's that simple. This changes the game for supply chain diversification. Many Western manufacturers thought they were safe because they bought from non-Chinese assemblers, but that diversification was an illusion. The Chinese content is embedded further upstream. China's export control strategy deserves specific attention because it is more sophisticated than a blanket restriction. After Beijing imposed controls on 7 heavy rare earths in April 2025 and expanded to 12 by October, something notable happened in the trade data. Exports of rare earth metals and compounds, the upstream, less processed form, fell below prior baselines. But exports of rare earth permanent magnets, the downstream, higher value product, actually increased. That is deliberate asymmetry. China is tightening the flow of raw and semi-processed inputs while accelerating the export of finished components. The effort is to push value addition further inside China, force foreign manufacturers to source finished magnets rather than raw materials, and increase China's share of the final product market. Buyers who used to import dysprosium oxide to make their own magnets now find the oxide harder to obtain and increasingly turn to Chinese-made magnets instead. The licensing system adds a further layer of flexibility. Controls can be tightened or eased by element, by end user, by country, and by application. In November 2025, ahead of a Trump-Xi summit, Beijing agreed to temporarily suspend some newly announced controls on 5 rare earth elements for 1 year. This is a diplomatic pause that expires in November 2026. The pause was targeted and reversible. It was not a structural concession. The architecture being built is one that Beijing can dial up or down with considerable precision in trade disputes, as a defense sector leverage tool, as a mechanism for accelerating domestic downstream manufacturing, or simultaneously. The initial US response to Chinese critical mineral dominance followed a predictable path: rebuild domestic mining capacity, restart mountain pass in California, support rare earth projects in allied countries, restrict US defense contractors from purchasing Chinese rare earth materials. That response is necessary but insufficient. And the more analytically interesting development is that US policy is beginning to acknowledge this. The CFR's 2026 analysis argues explicitly that the US must leapfrog, not replicate China's choke points, meaning that attempting to build a Western rare earth processing chain that competes on China's terms is not a viable near-term strategy, given the capital requirements, lead times, and accumulated know-how involved. The alternative framing centers on 3 things: alliances and reserves, innovation in substitutes and recycling, and selective investment in the specific processing steps where non-Chinese capacity can be built at credible scale. To counter this, Washington is running a multi-layered response, though it rarely gets analyzed as a unified strategy. First, look at the diplomatic layer. The US recently convened a critical mineral ministerial, bringing together the UK, the EU, India, South Korea, Australia, and crucially, the DRC. The goal here is to establish a coordinated, Western-aligned trade zone for these inputs. But for an asset allocator, the structural question remains open. Can a coalition like this actually agree on common standards, pricing floors, and cross-border investment frameworks, or would it simply be undercut by the massive cost differential between Chinese and Western processing? Then there's the raw defensive layer, stockpiling. The US has committed nearly $12 billion to what they are calling Project Vote. This isn't just a routine procurement exercise, it is a direct, public acknowledgement that commercial supply chains are broken in a conflict scenario. In a world of risk management, where the market cannot guarantee delivery, you build a fortress. Project Vote is that fortress. But the third layer, and the one that the financial press consistently underweights, is material science. This is where the US retains a genuine comparable advantage. Recent analysis from CFR and SIPRI point to the same baseline. The ultimate way to defeat a choke point is to make it irrelevant. If Western automotive and defense contractors can commercialize next-generation electric motors that use reduced content or entirely rare earth-free magnets, the geopolitical leverage map changes instantly. A breakthrough in a materials lab in California or Munich does something that digging new mines or signing diplomatic memos can never achieve. It destroys the value of the choke point itself. The framing that dominates most coverage of this topic is a straightforward supply security story. China controls the materials, the West is exposed. The response is to build more mines. What that framing misses is the role of the resource-holding countries, the DRC, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Chile, Australia, Brazil, which are not passive actors in this system. They hold the geology. They have choices about who finances their mines, who process their ore, and under what terms. And increasingly, some of them are attempting to exercise those choices. The DRC, who holds more than 70% of the world's cobalt reserves, has enacted processing requirements that push refiners to add value domestically before exporting. Indonesia has done the same with nickel, banning raw nickel ore exports to force downstream investments. Zimbabwe has also imposed restrictions on raw lithium ore exports. This dynamic complicates China's upstream investment strategy in ways that are not fully visible in the current data. Chinese companies have invested heavily in DRC copper and cobalt assets on the assumption that processing would occur in China. Resource nationalism, the political tendency for governments to demand more value from their extractive resources, is a variable that Chinese state-backed investors have not always priced correctly. Now let's look at the second-order effect. Western governments want to diversify away from Chinese processing. At the exact same time, resource-rich countries want to process their own minerals to capture more value at home. These two pressures are working together, and they are creating a global supply chain that is more fragmented, more expensive, and much slower. Make no mistake, China's dominance will erode at the margin, but we are not going to see a clean, efficient Western alternative take its place neither. Instead, we are heading toward a proliferation of smaller, less efficient processing hubs all over the world. Each of these nodes will serve a much narrower customer base. This is a far more disorderly outcome than most people realize. The current debate usually offers two simple paths. Either China wins or the West builds an alternative. The reality is much messier, and this fragmented landscape is the more accurate picture for the medium term. Now here are the three signals worth watching in the near term. First, the November 2026 expiry of the rare earth control pause. The one-year suspension of controls on 5 rare earth elements expires in November 2026. Whether Beijing renews that pause, lets it lapse, or expands the underlying restrictions will tell you a great deal about how China reads the current state of the trade relationship and how it intends to use the export control architecture going forward. This is a concrete, datable signal, not a diffuse strategic trend. Second, whether Western processing projects hit their stated timelines. MP Materials in the US, Lynas in Australia and Malaysia, and Iluka in Australia are the three most significant non-Chinese rare earth processing operations at meaningful scale. All have announced expansion targets for 2025 to 2027. Whether those targets are hit and whether the expanded capacity is actually purchased by end users rather than remaining on paper is the real-world test of whether the rebuilt Western processing strategy is working or remains aspirational. Third, progress on rare earth-free or reduced content magnet technologies. Now let's talk about where the real disruption could come from. Material science. Right now, university labs and R&D programs across the US, Europe, and Japan are quietly innovating. They are completely rethinking motor design and magnet composition. Make no mistake, this is a slow-moving indicator. It takes time, but it is also the single most critical variable because it could fundamentally alter the geopolitical leverage map. Think about it this way. What happens if we commercialize a new motor architecture? One that reduces rare earth content by 30 to 50%. That single breakthrough could change the strategic calculus. In fact, it would move the needle more than any amount of the new investment in mining. The standard story about China and the critical minerals focuses on geography. Which country has the deposits? That focus is understandable and not wrong, but it is not where the leverage sits. The leverage sits in chemistry plants, refining facilities, and accumulated engineering know-how that took decades to build and would cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and a decade or more to replicate that comparable scale. China built that position deliberately. It has since converted it into a flexible policy instrument, tightening upstream materials, accelerating downstream component exports, and extending licensing jurisdiction across borders in ways that mirror the US extraterritorial controls it was designed to counter. The US response is moving from catch-up mining toward a combination of alliances, reserves, and innovation, which is the more credible strategic direction. But it is still early stage, underfunded relative to the gap, and operating against a Chinese system that has a 15 to 20-year head start in the midstream. And the resource-holding countries in the middle are not simply accepting the terms set by either side. That dynamic, resource nationalism meeting geopolitical competition in the same set of minds, is the part of the story that will become more visible over the next 2 to 3 years, and that neither the Chinese nor the Western strategic narrative has fully priced. This has been the China Memo. Thank you for listening. A standing note before I go, nothing in this episode constitutes investment advice, a recommendation to buy or sell any asset, or a view of any specific company or security. The China Memo is an analytical briefing. All figures and assessments are drawn from publicly available sources.